the haunting of Huong Kien village. Huong Kien village lies near the lower reaches of a river, surrounded by towering mountains. Here, thick fog blankets the area in winter, and in summer, the rains fall constantly. The villagers primarily live by fishing in the large river that winds around the village, a river that begins from small streams flowing through the mountain crevices. In the village, there is a man named Kien, known as the most skilled fisherman. However, he always goes fishing alone, often at night, and ventures deep into the mountains, so few young men dare to accompany him. Kien and his young wife, who are yet to have children, live a peaceful life year-round in their modest thatched house. One night, Kien stayed home, as his wife Hui had suddenly developed a fever, fluctuating between hot and cold, and had been delirious all day. The village healer, Old Bay, visited, checked her pulse, and prescribed some medicine, saying she had caught a cold from the damp weather, and with a week's worth of medicine, she would recover. That night, Kien stayed by his wife's side, fanning her continuously. The small wood stove was boiling her medicine when he heard a voice outside. "Kien, are you home?" He lifted the thin curtain at the door, and there stood a tall, skinny man in unevenly rolled-up pants, holding a woven fan, with a faint scent of medicinal herbs lingering on him. Under the flickering oil lamp light, the man's weary face and squinting eyes seemed to peer closely to identify who had called him. "Oh, it's Bin. What brings you here so late?" asked Kien. Bin replied, "I heard your wife is unwell. I came to borrow your raft to go night fishing since my raft sank in the river earlier. If you're not using yours tonight, may I borrow it just for tonight? I'll fix mine tomorrow." "Sure, it's outside. Take it. But bring it back to the dock when you're done," Kien replied. Bin thanked him, then went outside, untying the raft's rope and paddling it toward his house. Kien closed the door and returned to his wife. Later that night, heavy rain began to pour, causing the river to rise, and every household locked their doors tight, falling asleep under warm blankets. The rain drowned out a faint, heartbreaking cry for help. Thick fog shrouded the night, concealing a heartless crime. The next morning, as the rain ceased and the sky cleared, a heavy scent from the damp earth lingered. With the sun barely up, Bin returned early to bring Kien's raft back. As he approached, he noticed something bobbing on the river, not far from Kien's house. Curiously, despite the current, the object remained in place. Intrigued, Bin paddled closer and squinted, mumbling to himself, "What on earth is that? I've lived here over 25 years and never seen anything like it." As he came within a few paces of the object, he froze, dropping his pole, eyes wide in shock, his face paling as he shouted, There's a body. Someone drowned. Help!" His cries broke the early morning peace, prompting villagers to gather and see what was happening. Kien, hearing the commotion, came out to see, too. When he spotted a young woman's body floating in the river, he ran down with a large pole, carefully pushing her to the riverbank. By then, a crowd had gathered, murmuring in shock, wondering who she was and why such a tragedy had befallen her. This was the first death in the river anyone could remember. When Kien flipped the body over, an eerie silence fell over the onlookers as they recognized her. It was Ha, the youngest daughter of Teacher Hin, a kind, gentle, and beautiful girl admired by many in the village, including Bin. Teacher Hin was paralyzed with shock, while his wife ran over, wailing and clutching her daughter's lifeless body. "Keep the elderly back," Kien said gently, "and call for Madame Crane to perform the rites." Kien looked at Utha's lifeless body with sorrow. Her thin, torn clothes were disheveled, and bruises covered her skin. A large rope was tied tightly around her waist. As the villagers began to disperse, Kien and a few others stayed behind, waiting for the ritual woman to arrive and perform the ceremony to bring Utha's spirit home. In Qian's memory, Ha was a lively, intelligent, and kind-hearted girl who often helped the villagers. She was friendly to everyone and had no known enemies. Bin sat nearby, staring at Utha, remembering the cheerful conversations they used to have. But now, she lay there cold and lifeless on the riverbank. Suddenly, something clicked in his mind, and he began mumbling incoherently. As if realizing something, he stood up to leave, but Kien grabbed his arm. "Where are you going? What are you planning to do?" "Brother, the only one who could have done this to Utha is Tin. He's been pursuing her, and when she rejected him, he must have taken revenge. I have to find him. I have to kill him." "Are you out of your mind, Bin? Do you have any proof to accuse him?" "With no evidence. If you kill him, his family will report you, and you'll be the one in trouble. What will your parents do then?" But, Bin stammered. "If she died unjustly, she won't let her killer go unpunished." "Calm down. For now, let's wait for Madame Crane to arrive, and then help me bring her body home," Kien replied, pulling him back down. Bin wiped away his tears and sat quietly next to the body, which had already been covered with a white cloth. About 10 minutes later, Madame Crane arrived and began the ceremony to call back Ha's spirit. Everything proceeded smoothly, and by midday, Utha's body was placed in a coffin in the center of the house. The heart-wrenching cries of Mrs. Hin echoed throughout the village. She had fainted 3 times since hearing the tragic news. That very night, they buried the coffin in the village cemetery. Kien stayed at the funeral until around 2 in the afternoon before returning home. As his wife was still ill, when he got back, he went to the river to wash his hands, face, and feet, then entered the house. He took a large jar of salt, usually used for salting fish, and scattered it at the front gate and the spot where he had found Utha's body that morning. Kien gently lifted the curtain and stepped inside. At some point, Hai had woken up. Beside her was a bowl of plain porridge with sugar, half-eaten. She must have gone to the kitchen herself to cook it. The coal stove near the bed had long gone out, and the house felt slightly chilly. Kien helped her lie back down, rekindled the stove, and went to the kitchen to fetch the medicine pot he had planned to brew that morning but hadn't had time to bring upstairs. He carefully spoon-fed her the thin porridge, and she cooperated, finishing it all. She then asked, "Is something happening in the village today? I've heard a lot of noise since morning." "Yes," Kien replied. "Ha, Teacher Hin's daughter, drowned. They're holding a funeral for her." Hai looked shocked, her eyes widening in disbelief. After 15 years in the village, apart from the stories of old age and illness, this was the first time a tragic death like this had struck the community. Kien recounted the events to her, and she felt deep pity for the young woman who had died in her prime. "Do the villagers suspect anyone?" she asked. "No one dares to say anything," he replied. "They've called someone from the district to investigate. Bin suspects Tin, but without evidence. It's hopeless. If he's not careful, he might be arrested for false accusations." Tin, the person Kien mentioned, was infamous in the village and beyond. He was the only son of Mr. and Mrs. Huong, who had become wealthy after a rumor led them to a gold mine near Huong. They once were small-time merchants, but luck made them rich, and now they lived in a grand 3-section mansion far removed from the villagers. Over time, they became distant from everyone, interacting only with high-ranking officials from the province. Tin, aware of his family's newfound wealth, had a lot of money to waste and was notorious for his behavior. Despite his young age, he hadn't spared any vice, and Mr. Thuong had repeatedly paid off gangsters to protect him. Many shook their heads in disapproval when Tin's name came up. One time, after being forbidden to leave the village, Tin crossed paths with Utha by the river. Her gentle beauty captivated him, and he approached her, striking up a casual conversation. Although Utha had heard of his bad reputation, she wasn't too wary since he spoke mildly. That was the first time they met. Kien poured the steaming medicine from the pot into a small bowl and raised Hai's pillow so she could take it. Outside, clouds gathered, and the wind grew stronger, signaling an impending downpour. By afternoon, a heavy rain blanketed the sky, and the cold wind blew fiercely, halting all activity on the river as everyone stayed indoors. Amidst the rain's constant roar, the villagers could hear the faint sound of prayers and a mother's wailing for her lost child. There was also the silent fear within the mind of the murderer, who, hiding under thick blankets, kept all doors shut tightly. Late that night, they dug a deep grave and lowered Utha's coffin into it, covering it under the relentless drizzle. The rain wasn't heavy, but it soaked their clothes, clinging coldly to their skin. The solemn, quiet procession continued under dark skies. As they filled in the grave, Mrs. Hin nearly threw herself into the pit to join her beloved daughter. The funeral procession mourned deeply for the young girl, pitying her tragic fate. Now, her home was left with only the elderly parents, whispering to one another in sorrow. At the same time, an unusual event occurred at the grandest house in Huong Kien village. Just as Ut's coffin was placed carefully over the 7-foot-deep grave, a bolt of lightning struck right in front of Tin's room. In the flash, Tin glimpsed a ghostly figure of a young woman in white standing under the tree that had been hit. Smiling at him, terrified, he froze, unable to scream, and quickly covered his head with a blanket, huddling in the corner of his bed, mumbling incoherently before unknowingly drifting into a disturbed sleep. In his sleep, Tin cried out, begging, "Don't take me! Spare me!" His parents, hearing his shouts from the far end of the hall despite the heavy rain, hurried over in alarm. Mrs. Huong cradled her frightened son, trying to calm him as he mumbled continuously in her arms. Worried for her son, she looked at her husband with concern. "My dear," she whispered, "could it be that someone has cursed our Tin, summoning a ghost to haunt him? Perhaps we should invite Master Hai from the province to come and perform a ceremony." "All right," Mr. Huong agreed. "Tomorrow, I'll have our servants go to the province to fetch Master Hai and see what he advises." Master Hai was a well-known spiritual practitioner, skilled in conducting ceremonies and appeasing spirits. The Huong family frequently sought his services, paying him handsomely each time. Despite the expense, they considered it worthwhile, as his rituals seemed to bring prosperity to Mr. Huong's business. The next morning, the Huong family's servants drove to the province and returned by noon with Master Hai. As he stepped out of the car, the Huongs greeted him warmly. He nodded approvingly and began, "I've read your letter detailing the situation. It seems that someone has indeed brought harm to your son. Prepare yourselves. Tonight, I'll hold a ritual under the struck tree to find out what the spirit wants and who is behind this." "Yes, Master, we are entirely at your disposal," they replied respectfully. Master Hai entered the house, took out a piece of paper, and listed the items needed for the evening's ceremony. He handed it to the Huongs before retreating to the room he always used when visiting. All day, the house remained eerily quiet. Tin didn't have his usual outbursts. Instead, he sat on the porch, staring blankly at the lightning-scorched tree. Mrs. Huong felt relieved, thinking that the presence of Master Hai's spiritual aura was warding off any malevolent forces. The servants took the list, along with a bag of money from Mrs. Huong, and headed to the market to buy the necessary items. Their conspicuous shopping attracted attention, and soon, people began gossiping. Kien, who was at the market to buy ingredients to cook porridge for Hai, overheard the whispers. Some speculated that the spirit haunting Tin could be Utha, the unfortunate girl buried just yesterday. Kien paused, uneasy at the mention of Utha. The villagers suspected Tin first because he had a reputation for troubling others, especially women. People thought he might have taken drastic measures after she repeatedly rebuffed his advances. While these rumors were speculative, Kien found them plausible. Still, he decided it was not his place to judge without knowing the full truth. so he focused on selecting a bag of fruit, Hai's favorite, and paid before leaving. On the way home, he ran into Bin, who had just returned from somewhere. They walked together, and suddenly Bin asked, "Did you hear what the people at the market were saying?" "Yes, I did, but we shouldn't jump to conclusions without evidence. Let's avoid casting blame unfairly. Karma works its way around. Those who do evil will eventually face justice." Bin nodded, clenching his lips tightly. He looked up to Kien as an older brother, someone who had protected him since childhood, and he respected Kien's words, never daring to contradict him. That night, Master Hai set up a grand altar under the scorched tree, lighting candles that illuminated the area. Holding a large bundle of incense, he recited a lengthy prayer. Mr. and Mrs. Huong stood respectfully with folded hands, while Tin sat nearby, staring blankly, occasionally laughing vacantly or trembling, pointing toward the tree while muttering incoherently. Master Hai's chanting lasted so long that half of the incense bundle burned down before he inserted it into a bronze urn. Then, taking the remaining incense, he began circling the tree, sticking the incense into the ground as he went, muttering something incomprehensible. The Thuongs followed him closely, chanting Namo Amitabha Buddha in unison, not leaving his side for a moment. Just as the last incense was placed into the ground, a sudden lightning bolt struck, illuminating the sky. Startled, Master Hai stumbled back, stepping on Mrs. Thuong's skirt, causing them both to fall. Reaching up to touch his face, Master Hai felt a wet substance. Bringing his hand down, he saw it was a deep red liquid, trickling down from his forehead to his eyes, nose, and chin. The master cried out in alarm. It's rain, but why?" Despite Mr. Thuong's attempts to reassure him, the master looked closely and confirmed that it was indeed rain. Yet it was stained red, like blood. Just then, Tin, who had been sitting quietly in the chair behind, suddenly stood up. His eyes were wide. His hand pointed toward the base of the flamboyant tree, and he clearly uttered each word. "Utha is back. She's back to take my life. No, no. Please spare me." Everyone felt a chill down their spine. Mr. Thuong froze, not daring to look at the tree. Following Tin's gaze, the master turned and let out a horrified scream, scrambling on the ground in a desperate attempt to flee back into the house. The spiritual master had fled, and the Thuong couple, terrified, didn't dare stay either. Mrs. Thuong, lifting her dress, ran a few steps before remembering her precious son was still standing in the bloody rain. Laughing foolishly, she screamed at the servants nearby, "For heaven's sake, get the young master inside and change his clothes, or he'll fall ill." The household staff, who were also in a state of panic, only then noticed Tin. Two servants rushed him into his room and shut the door tightly. Under the red rain, the people scattered, fleeing the scene. The large altar was abandoned, offerings scattered everywhere. Fruits rolled across the ground. Those left untouched were crushed by fleeing feet, and the incense had long been extinguished. If even a powerful spiritual master like this had run away, how could ordinary mortals like them stand a chance? They hastened to return to their rooms, locking the doors tightly for safety. That eerie red rain instilled fear among the villagers, and they began to suspect something was amiss. Everything seemed strange since the day Utha had passed. That night, as the river swelled from the rain, not a single young man dared to venture out onto the river to fish. Every home was tightly shut, the lights extinguished early. In Mr. and Mrs. Hin's empty house, only the elderly couple remained, leaning on each other. They had long since fallen asleep when suddenly Mr. Hin mumbled in his sleep, "Father, I am your unfilial daughter, unable to care for you in this life because I was murdered by the wicked. In my next life, may I return as your loyal daughter once again. But for now, I must avenge those who wronged me." Startled, Mr. Hin awoke with a start, his wife beside him patting his back. Her aging face reflected worry, for since Utha's death, he had not had a peaceful night's sleep. often waking abruptly or wandering in his sleep, guided by something to the window, where he would sit all night at the spot where their unfortunate daughter once loved to sit. He looked at his wife with sorrow-filled eyes, grasping her hand as he recounted what he had just dreamed. Both were at a loss, unable to understand who had so cruelly harmed their daughter. Mr. Hin, a lifetime teacher, had always been gentle and kind, and his wife, plain and honest, never involved herself in idle gossip. Utha had been a gentle, obedient girl, never causing enmity. Yet now, in the pouring rain, in every humble home, people slept soundly. But in the largest house in the village, there was no rest. Lights stayed on all night, illuminating a yard stained red from the strange rain. Mrs. Huong, alarmed at the sight in the morning, immediately ordered the servants to fetch water and clean every corner thoroughly before Mr. Huong awoke. The servants busily scrubbed the house, and Mrs. Huong quietly entered the opposite room, tiptoeing as she did. That night, as Kien went fishing and Hai stayed home alone, she watched him disappear into the night, sighed, locked the door tightly, and turned in. After leaving home, Kien went straight to his usual fishing spot. About 10 meters from his house, he suddenly heard singing. He stopped and looked around, puzzled. The voice was like a mixture of singing and sobbing, a young woman's voice, full of grief, thinking someone might be lost. He looked around but saw no one. One side was the riverbank, the other a gravel road, with nowhere to hide. So where had the sound come from? Kien, it's Utha. I'm here, brother. Kien froze at the mention of Utha's name, turning around quickly. There, on the dark river, floated a faint white figure. Squinting, he recognized Utha, her slender form, her oval face still beautiful but paler than before, her eyes lacking the bright spark of youth. Don't be afraid, brother. She spoke softly. I've come to ask you for a favor. Grant me peace. I died young and unjustly, unable to repay my parents or return Bin's love. I linger here, tied to this river. Please, care for my parents. With that, Utha turned and walked across the river, leaving Kien standing there, staring after her. As her figure faded into the night, a shiver ran down his spine, her words echoing in his mind. He realized she had gone in the direction of the Huong household. Kien frowned in suspicion but didn't linger, hoisting his fishing gear onto his shoulder and continuing to his fishing spot in the mountain streams as planned. Whether through luck or something else, Kien's fishing was unusually successful. By around 4 in the morning, his basket was already full. Satisfied with his catch, he gathered his things and headed home. As he returned, the sun was just rising, casting its first rays across the village. Near his house, Kien stopped, noticing something floating on the river's surface, eerily similar to the day he found Utha. He approached cautiously, using his fishing rod to pull it to shore. Curious villagers gathered around as they watched Kien flip the object over to reveal what it was. Everyone was horrified because it was Tin's body, the son of Mr. and Mrs. Huong. He had died exactly where the girl, had been found, in the same position. The only difference was that Tin's body was not intact. Some of his skin had been nibbled away by fish. The servants of the Huong family received the terrible news about their young master and rushed to knock on the couple's door. Mrs. Huong hadn't heard anything yet, but hearing the commotion, she yelled from her bed. What on earth are you all clamoring about at this hour? Who died that you're acting like this? What happened to the young master? One of them rushed to report. Ma'am, they found the young master's body in the river, in the middle of the village. Mr. Huong, who had just put on his slippers, was stunned at the news. Mrs. Huong was so shocked that she almost lost her balance. You, call the teacher to the river right now, she ordered, her eyes flashing red with anger. Mr. Huong held her up, also astonished, having never seen his wife so fierce. Her jewelry-adorned hands gripped the wooden door frame tightly, while one hand clung to him as he tried to steady himself. When Teacher Hai's door opened, Mrs. Thuong shot him a sharp glare as if she wanted to devour him. He, seeing her gaze, laughed nervously and accompanied Mr. and Mrs. Thuong to the river where Tin's body was found. The villagers had already covered him with a straw mat. Blood from the fish-bitten wounds had dried along the river's edge. Not many people were left at the scene, just Kien and his wife, Bin, and Mr. and Mrs. Hin. Kien stared at Tin's body, and a thought flashed through his mind, his eyes narrowing before widening with realization. Noticing his expression, Bin asked, "Brother, what's wrong? Is something the matter?" His wife, sitting behind, looked over to see what was happening to him. Kien kept staring intently at Tin's unmoving body, then shared the troubling thought that had been haunting him and recounted the events of the previous night for everyone to hear. All felt pity, and Mr. and Mrs. Hin began to cry loudly. Soon after, Mr. and Mrs. Thuong arrived with Teacher Hai. Mrs. Thuong stood a few steps away from her son's body, her makeup smeared by tears. She suddenly moved forward, but Mr. Hai stopped her. Mr. Thuong held her back as well. The servants brought a stretcher to lift Tin's body, being careful since they were river people and knew that when someone drowns, the family should not come too close, lest the 7 orifices of the body begin to bleed. A bad omen. Teacher Hai quickly set up an altar to pray at the riverside where Tin's body was retrieved. The villagers watched as they carried out the rituals. When the ceremony was over, Teacher Hai allowed the servants to carry Tin's body back home, with Mr. and Mrs. Thuong and the teacher following behind. Watching this, Bin felt a surge of anger, thinking, they pulled the son out of the river, had a ceremony to their satisfaction, then turned and left without a word of thanks. How disgraceful! But Kien stopped him. Let them be. It's none of our concern. Everyone, let's disperse and go home. After everyone had left, Kien stood under the porch, watching the elderly figures of Mr. and Mrs. Hin, feeling a twinge of sadness. His wife reminded him, "Utha came back to tell us, so from now on, let's look after them a little more. After all, they're alone. It must be lonely." Kien nodded, agreeing that even without Utha's reminder, he would have wanted to help. Years ago, when his parents passed away early, it was Mr. and Mrs. Hin who fed him, helping him grow up. The education he received was thanks to Mr. Hin. Now, seeing them in such unfortunate circumstances, he couldn't turn a blind eye. After a bath, he lay down for a short nap while his wife prepared fish in a large basket and placed several jars of freshly sealed fish sauce that she had prepared that morning for him to sell at the market. She added extra, packing a box with 10 eggs from their chickens to gift to Mr. and Mrs. Hin. Bin arrived shortly after to ask Kien to go to the market with him. Kien hoisted the large baskets over his shoulder, bidding his wife farewell before leaving. Their fish sold out in 2 or 3 hours, and the fish sauce, which his wife had made famous at the market, sold out almost instantly. Some buyers even took 3 or 4 jars to keep at home. After packing up, Kien went to wait for Bin to finish selling his nets and other fishing gear, and they returned home together. The market was lively until the appearance of the Thuong family's servants, which caught everyone's attention. News of Tin's death had spread throughout the market that morning. But why were the servants wearing white mourning bands on their heads? Bin leaned in to whisper to Kien, "Brother, I thought only the family of the deceased wore mourning bands. Why are these guys wearing them? Did Mr. and Mrs. Thuong order them to mourn their young master?" Kien replied, "Don't ask me. How should I know what's going on in their household?" That night, Teacher Hai chose an auspicious time to move Tin's coffin to a large bed at the back of the house for burial. He was meant to be buried in the village cemetery, but Mrs. Thuong refused, insisting that her cherished son should not be laid to rest with others. Her stubbornness was well known, and Mr. Thuong, not wanting to create a scene during a time of mourning, gave in, setting aside a piece of land behind the house to bury their son. In the days that followed, many came to pay their respects, mostly merchants and business associates. Only Kien represented the village. As he entered the Huong household, he observed the room's lavish wooden decorations, intricately carved and decorated. Despite the presence of Buddhist altars, the house felt dark and eerie, as if spirits lingered within. On his way out, he passed a corridor leading to Tin's room, where a large phoenix tree stood, long scorched by lightning, yet still kept by the family instead of being cut down for firewood. Though curious, he left without dwelling on it, continuing on his way. As he neared home by the sandy riverbank, he suddenly saw the figure of someone sitting on the riverbank, drinking alone. Without needing to guess, he knew it was Bin. Every evening, Bin would bring a bottle of liquor here to sit like this. For the first couple of days, people would remind him to go home. But now, after 3 or 4 days, everyone had started ignoring him. Others might not understand, but Kien did. He knew exactly why Bin was doing this. It wasn't because he was drowning in alcohol, he was still diligent with his work. But each night, he was overwhelmed with memories of Utha, unable to accept her sudden passing. The riverbank where Bin sat was also the place where he and Utha first met and fell in love. That day, Kien and Bin were paddling down the river on a raft, keeping an eye out to spear large fish and also just enjoying a leisurely float. Utha, still a little girl at the time, was on the bank, struggling to wash clothes. Her tiny hands could barely manage the heavy laundry, and the strong current caused one of the shirts to drift away. Panicked, she let go of the basin and ran after it, unaware that the water had already reached her chest. Fortunately, they passed by just in time to pull her onto the raft. Kien used a long pole to retrieve her drifting clothes. Back then, she was small, with slightly tanned skin, but her smile was bright, and her big round eyes sparkled like a million stars. From that moment, Bin had fallen for her. As they grew up, Bin and Utha were inseparable, childhood sweethearts, perfect pair. Seeing Bin sitting there, Kien shook his head. That evening, the sun set behind the tall mountains, while the red river kept flowing tirelessly. 2 men sat side by side, drinking in silence, not saying a word to each other. Yet their hearts resonated with unspoken feelings. Oil lamps began to light up in each house in the village as people hurriedly prepared for dinner. In the distance, the sound of a funeral band echoed from the largest house in the village. That night, according to Teacher Hai's schedule, Tin's coffin was to be sealed at exactly 10 p.m. Everything went smoothly. The overwhelming number of visitors had exhausted Mr. and Mrs. Huong. Though not everyone had left, the servants remained to burn paper offerings in front of the coffin, while the couple had to retreat to their room to rest. No sooner had they laid down on their comfortable bed than they heard the servants stirring up a commotion in the front hall. The door to Teacher Hai's room, opposite Mr. and Mrs. Huong's, was being knocked on urgently. The couple grumbled as they got out of bed, only to find a group of people gathered outside Teacher Hai's door. Mrs. Thuong's sharp voice carried over. "What are you all making so much noise for?" One of the servants, visibly shaken, stammered, Madam, it's the young master. It seems he came back to life." The fragmented words, filled with the servant's terror, left Mr. and Mrs. Thuong, as well as Teacher Hai, frozen in place. Came back to life? How could he come back to life? We all saw that Tin was dead, pulled from the river. Teacher Hai's eyes darted back and forth. A dead body coming back to life. And on the night of a full moon. Could it be? He grabbed the shoulder of a kneeling servant and asked in a stern voice, "Tell me, what exactly do you mean by came back to life?" The servant replied, "Sir, just now, we were burning offerings in front of the young master's coffin when a black cat suddenly jumped in. We tried to chase it away, but it was too quick. It leapt onto the coffin and disappeared. Right after that, the coffin started shaking and fell to the floor. The cover came off, and the young master's body rolled out. We were so frightened that we ran straight here." "Oh no," muttered Teacher Hai, calculating with his fingers. "A black cat jumping over a corpse is a terrible omen. It signifies resurrection." Teacher Hai ran out to the front hall, muttering about the incompetence of the servants. Mrs. Huong followed closely, shouting, "Worthless fools! Can't even guard a coffin properly." The servants, terrified, followed at a careful distance. When Teacher Hai reached the front hall and stood at the large doorway, he froze. Everyone who arrived behind him did the same, not daring to look. To the ordinary eyes, they only saw Tin's body, carefully dressed for burial that morning, now lying quietly on the patterned tile floor. A black cat sat right on top of the corpse. Seeing the group, it meowed 3 times before leaping through the window. "Catch that cursed cat and kill it for me," Mrs. Huong commanded furiously. But Teacher Hai interrupted her. "You won't catch it." "What do you mean, won't catch it? It's just a cat." "No, it's a spirit cat. Or more accurately, a demon cat. To your eyes, it appears as a cat sitting on Tin's body. But to a shaman like me, I see it as a female demon binding his soul. Just now, it finished binding him and took his soul away. Oh my heavens! What do we do now?" Mrs. Huong, trembling at the mention of a demon, lost her fierce composure. "This demon has only recently appeared, but its resentment towards your family is deep. There may be more deaths to come. For now, bring Tin's body back to the backyard and bury him properly. Tomorrow night, I will hold a ritual to summon the demon and ask for answers." Following Teacher Hai's instructions, 2 servants were assigned to place Tin's body back into the coffin. Their hands trembled as they gently touched the corpse, feeling the cold, stiff flesh through the burial clothes. As they lifted it, they suddenly dropped it with a loud thud. Mrs. Huong rushed over, slapping each of them across the face. "How dare you throw the young master's body like that? This month's wages will be docked for both of you." The servants silently placed the body back in the coffin, and Teacher Hai performed the final rites before moving the coffin to the backyard for burial. That night, the sky was clear, the full moon shining brightly. In the yard, a tall phoenix tree stood, scorched long ago by lightning. Facing the room where Tin used to live, a spirit sat on one of its branches, swaying gently, gazing intently at the funeral procession. Next to it, a chained spirit knelt, crying silently, unheard by anyone. Mr. Huong held a bundle of incense, chanting Namo Amitabha Buddha. He felt as though someone was watching him with sharp, terrifying eyes from behind. Feeling a chill, he looked around, but all he saw were the servants bowing their heads, continuing his prayer. He grew more and more fearful, closing his eyes tightly as he chanted, the incense shaking in his hand. The spirit of Udha, sitting on the tree branch, saw his fearful expression and let out a disdainful laugh before turning to Tin's spirit, who was sitting nearby, weeping. "Look at your father trembling in fear, just like I did that night. But he and you are beasts, and beasts don't deserve a human death, right?" Tin's spirit, not yet able to speak, heard this and cried even harder, looking down at his father, trying to call out but only managing pitiful whimpers. He continued trying for a while, but when he received no response from his father, he looked over at Udha, who was laughing mockingly, and drew back in fear. "Don't be so foolish. You're dead now. Your father can't hear you. Do you want to speak to him? I'll arrange for you both to meet soon enough." After Tin's coffin was buried, everyone returned to their rooms to rest after a day full of events. Mr. Huong lay down but couldn't sleep, resting his hand on his forehead as he pondered Teacher Hai's words. He knew Teacher Hai wasn't exactly a skilled shaman, more like an amateur who practiced half-heartedly. But his words couldn't be entirely dismissed. Thinking deeply, he tried to figure out who might hold such deep resentment toward his family, enough to want each of them dead. In the faint memories of a man past his prime, he recalled one night when he and Tin were returning from the province. As they passed by the river, they encountered that girl. "Min! Min!" Mrs. Thuong's loud voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He sat up abruptly, large beads of sweat rolling down his face and dripping onto his thin white shirt. His back was drenched. "What did you see that scared you so badly?" his wife asked. Mr. Huong waved his hand to show he was fine, stepped out of bed, put on his slippers, and walked to the back of the house. After hesitating, he hurried over to Teacher Hai's room. Seeing her husband's unusual behavior, Mrs. Huong grew suspicious. Mr. Huong had only been in Teacher Hai's room briefly when there was a loud knocking at the door. Mrs. Huong, who was seated at her dressing table, quickly pinned her hair in place with a clip and, annoyed, went outside. The servant, seeing her, stammered before she could even ask, "Ma'am, the young master's grave, something has happened to it." "What happened to his grave? Speak up," she demanded. "This morning, when we went to the back garden, we found the young master's grave was dug up. The coffin lid was exposed, and the plants around it, which were green yesterday, were all withered." "Ma'am." Those words struck Mrs. Huong like a thunderbolt. Just as Mr. Huong and Teacher Hai opened the door and stepped out, they froze in shock at the news. Mrs. Huong's eyes filled with red veins as she grabbed the servant's shoulder and frantically asked, Who dared touch my son's grave? Whoever did this, I'll cut off their hands. How dare they?" Mrs. Huong, in a frenzy, ran straight to the back garden where the grave had been desecrated. She was about to throw herself toward the grave when Mr. Huong managed to hold her back just in time, pulling her back inside. He instructed the servants to clean up the area and replace the flower pots. The servants bowed their heads and followed his orders. Some, frightened, used the excuse of going to the market to slip away. Teacher Hai stood quietly with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing thoughtfully at the scorched phoenix tree struck by lightning. Squinting, he looked intently at its highest branch. As for Mr. Huong, after bringing his wife back to her room and giving her a calming tonic, he changed his clothes and hurriedly went out. The servants whispered behind his back, criticizing him for leaving amidst such family turmoil, though they dared not say it out loud. Thanks to the servants who went out to the market, word of the strange occurrences at Mr. Huong's house spread throughout the village. Rumors flew about. Some said that Mr. and Mrs. Huong had been cursed by a rival merchant. Others whispered that someone with a grudge had dug up Tin's grave. Wild stories circulated, each one more outrageous than the last. Mr. Huong was gone the entire day, skipping both lunch and dinner. Mrs. Huong, alone at home, was restless, fanning herself so hard that her straw fan was close to tearing. Her mind began to wander, suspecting that her husband might have a mistress or was involved with someone in town. But their son had just died recently. How could he have the nerve to do something so disgraceful? After dinner, Mrs. Huong went to her room, and the servants, having finished their tasks, retreated to the quarters in the back. The door to Mrs. Huong's room was tightly shut, but suddenly it opened. A figure, bent low and looking around cautiously, sneaked in. Strangely, no sound of protest came from Mrs. Huong, as would be expected if a stranger had entered her room. On the rooftop of the opposite house, looking directly at the Huong's door, sat two ghostly figures. Tin's spirit, still bound, watched what was happening in his house. His mother and that person, how could they be doing this in the family home? He stared, wide-eyed, at the closed door of the room. "Ha! How pitiful," Utha sneered. "The old saying is true, corruption starts at the top. Your mother's unfaithful. Your father is a womanizer. And they gave birth to you, a wretched son. I've heard plenty of stories about your family from other spirits in the village. You didn't know any of this, did you?" Utha's mocking laughter echoed around him. Tin's spirit began to cry. But before he could dwell on his sorrow, Utha grabbed the chain binding him and led him to another, unfamiliar place. It was a small thatched house down a narrow alley, with a spacious front yard filled with flowers, a stone tea table, and a few drying rose petals left out. The two spirits sat on a tamarind tree branch, looking around the house. A gentle voice came from a woman in a jade green dress, her long, dark hair flowing down her back. her belly slightly swollen, suggesting she was 5 or 6 months pregnant. "Take care of yourself and the baby," the man told her. "I'll visit every week. I can't stand my wife at home anymore. She's been acting insane since Tin's death, and it's exhausting." The three of them know. All four sat together, laughing and drinking tea, with servants moving about, lighting lamps to brighten the house. Under the dim oil lamps, Tin's spirit stared wide-eyed. The man sitting there, enjoying his tea, was his own father, Mr. Huong, and the woman across from him was clearly his mistress. Tin's eyes filled with tears as he looked at Utha beside him. "Ha! As if you or your mother had a clue," Utha scoffed. "Everyone in the village knows about this. You haven't even been dead 7 weeks, and he's already here with his second family, laughing and happy. So much for a loving, virtuous family, rotting from the inside." Unable to bear the sight, Tin's spirit struggled, wanting to return to the phoenix tree at his home. But Utha glared at him, silencing him immediately. He was terrified of that look. The last time he had tried to resist, she had ordered other spirits to beat him until he was left helpless, bound and powerless to fight back. He knew he was no match for the other spirits. Just the thought of that punishment was enough to make him obediently quiet. That night, Mr. Huong stayed very late at the house before heading home. On the way, as his car passed the village cemetery, he suddenly told the driver to stop, then walked into the cemetery alone. No one knew why he would enter such a ghostly place at that hour, but it was as if someone was guiding him. When he came to his senses, he found himself standing before a grave adorned with various flowers. Incense sticks still burned, suggesting someone had visited recently. Looking at the paper offerings, combs, and clothes on top, he deduced it was a young woman's grave. A shiver ran down his spine as he read the tombstone. Nguyen and Ha, aged 20. Nguyen and Ha, Utha? Was this the grave of Utha, the daughter of Teacher Hin? How did he end up here? He had never visited this grave before. Why was he here now? Just as his mind raced with unanswered questions, 2 shadows emerged from the darkness, and a wild, haunting laughter filled the night. Mr. Huong stumbled backward, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground, his clean clothes now smeared with dirt. His instincts told him to leave as quickly as possible. Just as he was about to get up and run, a voice stopped him. "Why the rush to leave, Mr. Huong?" The voice sounded familiar, yet distant. From the shadows, a ghostly figure in white slowly approached, a wicked man at heart. Mr. Huong was paralyzed with fear upon seeing the spirit. He clutched his head, mumbling incoherently, hoping the ghost would go away. When there was silence, he dared to open his eyes, only to see the bruised, swollen form of Utha, her body bloated from long exposure in water, her clothes torn in places, exposing her flesh. Mr. Thuong's legs gave way as he tried to scream. Utha held a chain attached to another spirit, hunched over, recognizing his son, Tin. Mr. Huong was shocked, speechless, unable to form words. "Recognize him, Mr. Huong? Your son is in my hands. You could spend money on rituals to release him, but it would be a waste. Better save that money for your own coffin. You'll be joining us soon enough." Utha pulled Lu and Tin, disappearing into the deep, dark night ahead. Mr. Huong breathed heavily with each exhale, clutching his left chest where his heart throbbed in intense, sharp pains, as if someone was squeezing it tightly. He struggled to get up, his whole body swaying unsteadily, staggering away from the cemetery. He then urged the driver to hurry and drive him home, wanting to get as far away from this cursed place as quickly as possible. The loud knocking on the door woke up the household guards. They slowly opened the large wooden doors to see Mr. Huong with his clothes stained, hair disheveled, still covered in mud. His gait was unsteady, requiring someone to support him to walk. When Mrs. Huong heard that her husband had returned, she was angry, storming out with a scowl on her face, intending to question him about who he had been meeting in town all day. but seeing his messy, unkempt appearance, not a single spot left clean, and suspecting he was injured or had an accident, she restrained her usual fierceness and softened her tone. "All right, you there. Prepare hot water for him to bathe. And you, help him into the house. The other one, call the physician to see what's wrong with him. How did he end up like this?" After bathing, Mr. Huong lay on his stomach on the bed. The physician sat beside him, writing a prescription, while Mrs. Huong dabbed medicine on his bruises, from his falls and stumbles while fleeing the cemetery. After the physician left, she ordered someone to prepare the medicine. The room door closed, leaving just the couple alone. "Where did you go and with whom to end up like this?" The physician said, "These bruises look like you fell or tripped somewhere." "Oh, it's nothing. I was just careless." "How could that be? You've always been careful. Were you meeting someone?" "Enough. I told you it was just carelessness. Stop asking. Women are so bothersome. Get out." His voice turned sharp, scolding her loudly. At first, Mrs. Huang was stunned, as this was the first time he had dared to act this way. But soon, her irritation flared, interpreting his behavior as a sign he must be hiding a mistress, brushing her off with hostility when she questioned him. She didn't linger, slammed the medicine bowl onto the bed, and stomped out in her wooden sandals, each step echoing on the tiled floor, making his head ache. Suddenly, his vision blurred, images flickering in and out, tilting and straightening. Faintly, he recalled hearing the sound of those sandals before, and he suddenly remembered the time he pinned a girl down, slapping her as she screamed and begged. The louder her pleas, the harder he slapped, laughing louder each time. The sandals clacking echoed, until she passed out. Fragments of memory appeared disjointedly, unable to recall fully, with the sound of those sandals still ringing in his ears, making his head pound. Suddenly, a chilling voice echoed in his mind. "Use that money to buy yourself a few good coffins. I'll be waiting for you down here." His mind went blank. He clutched his head and let out a helpless scream, then fainted. As Mrs. Huang stepped outside, she heard her husband's piercing scream, yet she wasn't concerned, her anger only growing stronger. She waved her hand, summoning a servant from the shadows. "You, go take care of this for me." She whispered instructions to the servant, who quickly left. Mrs. Huang returned to her room, thinking no one would know. Yet two ghostly figures were sitting on the rooftop, watching it all. Husband schemes against wife, and wife plots against husband. "Looks like your father's mistress won't have an easy time having that baby." Utha knew well that Mrs. Huang had ordered someone to investigate her husband's activities that day. Soon, she would discover the mistress's location, and with her vicious, cruel nature, there was no way she'd let that woman live in peace, especially since she had recently lost her own child. And now, upon hearing that another woman might give her husband a child, she would probably be furious enough to tear that woman apart. "I don't intend to help anyone. Mr. Huang, Mrs. Huang, or even that woman. Their fate is sealed." Utha threw her head back, laughing loudly, while the timid ghost of little Tin shrank beside her. Only now did he understand that a once kind person, upon death with deep resentment, could become a malicious spirit, capable of all manner of evil, relishing watching family members destroy one another. Had he known his actions that night would lead him into a pit of no return, he wouldn't have done it even at the cost of his life. Looking at Utha sitting beside him, he suddenly remembered the girl he once liked, with her simple thoughts, innocent eyes, and sweet smile. Even though she avoided him, knowing he wasn't a decent person, he had never thought of going further with her. That night, he didn't understand why he acted as he did, leading to her hatred for his entire family, punishing each of his relatives relentlessly. That night, while Mrs. Huang was deep in sleep, she dreamed of a peculiar house in an alley she'd never seen before. In the yard, flowers were blooming, and in the center was a stone tea table, with a few drying roses scattered around. "Look, darling, Our child is healthy. The healer says it'll be a healthy little boy. Mrs. Thuong frowned in her sleep, hearing a voice that sounded unfamiliar. Definitely not from her, and not from anyone in the village. Her gold-ringed hands gripped the blanket tightly. In the meantime, the ghost of Ut Ha stood at the bedside, smirking. If Mrs. Thuong wanted to know, Ut Ha wouldn't hesitate to provide an answer. In her dream, she saw a man and woman at the stone table, enjoying tea together, the woman heavily pregnant, and the man leaning close to her belly to listen. Mrs. Thuong jolted awake, recognizing one of them as her husband, confirming that the other must be his mistress. Meanwhile, under the guidance of ghosts Ut Ha had sent, the servant Mrs. Thuong dispatched to investigate returned earlier than expected, slipping into her room with practiced stealth, a clear sign of being one of her trusted hands for shady tasks. Ut Ha and Tin spirits stood at the foot of the bed, witnessing everything. Upon hearing the report, jealousy surged through Mrs. Thuong, her gaze sharpening as she gestured a throat-slitting motion. Your father is truly ruthless, Ut Ha commented. Not just one life, but two. Yet she gave the order so calmly. Tin knelt on the ground, tears streaming down his face. He had always known his parents, as merchants, had resorted to countless tricks to bring down rivals. But he hadn't realized they plotted behind each other's backs as well. He had always thought his mother was just sharp-tongued and harsh with the servants, never imagining she would use others to commit such heartless acts. After the servant left, Mrs. Thuong wiped the sweat off her face, smiling as if she'd removed a thorn from her side, unaware that retribution would soon come for her, for every debt must be repaid. That same night, as Mr. Thuong slept in the nearby room, a loud thunderclap startled him awake. He looked around but saw no one. The medicine the servant had brought in had gone cold. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep again. But he had a vague vision of his young mistress, pregnant, her once beautiful face now bruised and bloodied, bleeding heavily from below, her body covered in wounds. He jolted upright, anxious and unsettled, refusing to believe that Mrs. Thuong could have discovered his mistress's whereabouts, since it was far away and well hidden. Still, he planned to visit them in a few days, after his wounds had healed. But perhaps Mr. Thuong's plans would never be realized, because as he lay down and drifted back to sleep, at the hidden place where he had concealed that woman, a brutal massacre was unfolding. Despite being 5 months pregnant, she was being assaulted and tormented by 5 or 6 robust peasant men. Ut Ha and Tin stood at a distance, watching it all. She clenched her fists, remembering that night when she had been in a similar situation. Tin could sense her murderous intent, so he remained silent behind her, not daring to speak or look at the barbaric acts of those brutes. When the souls of the woman and her unborn child left their bodies, Ut Ha immediately floated over. The woman's spirit, newly departed and filled with intense rage, didn't have time to process the afterlife before being pulled away by a strange soul. That spirit took her to a grand house she had never visited before. 3 spirits perched atop a towering phoenix tree, looking down with a cold gaze at the stately house below. Hello, I am Ha. One spirit greeted her. This is the house of your lover and the home of the person who ordered your death today, his wife. The woman broke into sobs, her tears streaming down as she remembered her death, screaming in grief with disheveled hair, her bloodshot eyes leaking blood and looking incredibly terrifying. Ut Ha sighed, and just as the woman was about to seek out Mrs. Thuong, Ut Ha tightly grabbed her arm, refusing to let go. The woman struggled to break free, but as a newly departed spirit, she was not as strong as Ha. Be calm, Ut Ha said. I want to take revenge on this household too, but we must wait a little longer. You just died and don't yet have the strength to overcome the charms protecting this house. Don't worry. When the time is right, I will give you her, the cruel woman, and as for that vile man, I'll handle him myself. Hearing that someone was willing to help her settle her grudge, the woman nodded, retracting her earlier desire to devour her enemies. Instead, she took on the gentle image of a mother, looking down at her slightly protruding belly. Sobbing softly, Utha did something, allowing the woman to finally cry out and speak. Utha wanted to hear her story. Even as ghosts, their situations and hatred were the same. Both were women, and Utha felt some sympathy for her. "I couldn't intervene to save you from those beasts," Utha began. "But I saved you from the hands of the black and white underworld guards and will help you exact revenge later. Now, tell me a bit about your past." The three spirits sat idly on branches. One was chained and kneeling to the side, residing on the charred, lightning-struck phoenix tree. The woman, sitting with her legs dangling and her hands intertwined, played with her fingers, her head lowered, before gradually recounting her life story and her first meeting with Mr. Huong. The woman's name was Ai, the daughter of a fabric merchant in the province. Her family was well off and had no financial worries. Born into a trading family, she was sharp-witted and quick at calculations. As a child, she often traveled with her father on boats, crossing rivers to source quality fabrics for sale. Her father, though a merchant, never used deceitful tactics to make a profit. A roll of fabric he imported wouldn't be sold at more than twice its cost. Unlike others. Because of this, people from across the province flocked to her family's store to buy fabric, as the imported fabric was affordable and reasonably priced for the common folk. Her father lived kindly and often organized rice donations for the poor, earning him much affection. Naturally, in life, love comes with hate, and unfortunately, their enemies far outnumbered their allies. Worse yet, their rivals were powerful. Among them was the Nguyen family, who had been in the fabric business for generations, monopolizing the market price in the province. They conducted business without a conscience, focused only on profit, disregarding the needs of the people. Their rule was to sell fabric only to high-ranking officials and wealthy clients, a clearly unreasonable business model. At that time, people even scavenged discarded, tattered clothes to wear. Initially, a few small fabric shops opened to sell at lower prices, attracting the locals. However, these shops quickly became thorns in the eye of the Nguyen family, and one by one, they disappeared without a trace. Seeing this, Ai's father was outraged by the Nguyen family's disdainful business practices. Determined, he sought fabric sources from other regions through his merchant friends. He traveled far and wide to negotiate and convince suppliers to collaborate with him. During those years of searching, her mother and she were by his side. Eventually, they secured enough suppliers and returned to the province, opening a fabric shop in their old clothing store. Their business, offering fair prices and quality goods, quickly rivaled the Nguyen family, even surpassing them in some fabrics. According to many customers, as demand grew, Ai's father opened his first branch, then a second, eventually totaling 4 branches and a main store. Initially, he was cautious of the Nguyen family, always careful and guarded. He even spent a considerable sum on bribes to high-ranking officials to overlook the competition with the Nguyen family. But after 2 years of running the fabric shop, he noticed no movement from the Nguyen family. The officials also assured him that the Nguyen family, having accumulated enough wealth over 100 years, had no interest in competing anymore. This eased his mind, and he let his guard down. The moment he relaxed his vigilance, disaster struck. Every shipment of fabric brought to the store was meticulously inspected by Ai's father. However, that night, for some reason, the warehouse guards fell into a deep sleep and couldn't wake until the morning shift came to relieve them. That same morning, a large shipment of fabric was distributed to the branches and the main store. As usual, in the evening, as her family was preparing to leave, a servant informed them that the fabric they sold contained a foreign substance. A customer who had bought it earlier had suffered a severe allergic reaction and died, with initial signs pointing to a toxic skin irritant. Her father was detained for a full day and night without returning. The following morning, a large mob came to cause trouble. Her mother sent someone to seek help from the officials. but they waited in vain, realizing that the officials must have accepted bribes from another party. The store was heavily vandalized, with people even setting fire to the fabric inside. Fortunately, the staff was able to extinguish the flames, but the other branches faced similar harassment. Reporting to the officials only yielded indifferent responses. Quickly, her father was convicted of colluding with fraudulent traders, selling poor-quality fabric that led to the death of 2 people. Overnight, their family's assets were seized. The branches and store were shut down, and the remaining fabric stocks were burned. Her father received a life sentence. Her mother fainted upon hearing the court's verdict, and when she awoke, she was no longer sane. That night, when they came to confiscate all her family's belongings, it wasn't just the officials who showed up, but also members of the Nguyen family. Upon hearing of his family's tragedy, her father took his own life in prison. On the last night, her mother, with a moment of clarity, instructed the nanny to take AI and flee, showing them a secret path out of the house. Through the years of wandering and struggling to survive, AI relied on the nanny to raise her, but eventually, the nanny also passed away one cold winter night, leaving AI alone on the streets, working odd jobs to survive. One day, in a chaotic fight where a crazed man wielded a knife, she saved Mr. Huong by blocking a blow meant for him. By coincidence, he took her in, providing her with a small rented house in the province and caring for her. Everything she had was given to her by him. However, from the very first meeting, he had deceived her, claiming he was single, with no wife or children, merely a small-time merchant, unworthy of mention. Hearing the word merchant gave her a bad impression, but over time, under Mr. Thuong's protection, her life gradually stabilized, and her attitude and thoughts about him changed. She slowly opened her heart to Mr. Thuong, even when she discovered he had a wife and children in another village. She still agreed to bear his child. When AI finished her story, her face was wet with tears. She looked down at her silent, protruding belly, filled with unending resentment. "Don't worry, I will help you," Utha said, her blood-red eyes fixed angrily on the house below. Kien, sitting beside her with teary eyes, shook his head pleadingly, as if begging for mercy for his parents. But his small actions meant nothing compared to the towering hatred of the 2 women. On the day of Utha's 7-week memorial, Mr. and Mrs. Kien and their son Bin had arrived early to help Mr. and Mrs. Hin prepare a simple offering table. When they looked up at her picture on the altar, they couldn't help but feel emotional. Utha's spirit watched, feeling a sharp ache in her heart. Tears of resentment flowed as she looked around the house, recalling each memory tied to her loved ones. She was reluctant to leave her family, but she knew that today's visit would be her last. Tomorrow, the Grim Reaper would take her to the underworld to face punishment. After leaving her family's house, Utha returned to the Phoenix Tree to discuss her plan for revenge with Tuesday AI. The ghostly Kien overheard their scheme, realizing this night would spell the end for his family. However, bound in chains, he could do nothing but watch helplessly, unable to warn his parents. That morning, Mrs. Thuong woke as usual and, upon opening the door, happened to meet Mr. Hai as he was just stepping outside. She cast him a flirtatious look, and he smiled knowingly before turning back inside. Meanwhile, Mr. Thuong was still deep in sleep. For several nights, he had been plagued by recurring nightmares and only managed to catch a bit of sleep by dawn. In his dreams, he saw a young boy toddling toward him, stopping short and staring at him with fierce, hateful eyes. Every time, the boy pointed behind him, but Mr. Thuong would awaken before he could fully turn around. He was desperate to know who the boy was and what he wanted to show him, but he could never find the answer. Over an hour later, the door to Mr. Hai's room finally opened, and Mrs. Thuong glanced around cautiously before slipping out. Adjusting her clothes, she grabbed a fan and started loudly instructing the household staff as usual, berating anyone who annoyed her, hitting and scolding, even threatening to cut wages. Such the image of a lady of the house. Utha sneered, watching Tin. Swift, ruthless, indifferent to the lives of others. Tin felt uncomfortable but, after seeing his mother's actions, could not deny the truth in Utha's words. Ai tilted her head, observing Tin. Over the past few days, she had come to understand why he had died and was now fully aware that Mr. Huong was a vile, despicable person, far from the respectable image he had shown her. It was nearly noon when Mr. Huong finally got out of bed. Hearing the household staff mention that Mrs. Huong was at Tin's grave, he scoffed and got dressed, wearing a freshly polished pair of shoes and a dousing of cologne. Clearly preparing to go somewhere, Ai's ghost stood in the corner, watching everything. But after what he had done to her and Ha, she could no longer feel anything for him. If I'm not mistaken, he's about to go see you, Utha remarked. Yes, Ai nodded. Every time he came, he dressed neatly and stopped at the most famous bakery in the province to buy me buns. Utha cut in before Ai could lose herself in emotion, and the three spirits followed Mr. Huong. Just as Ai had said, he stopped at a large bun shop, personally stepping in to buy some. From the moment he prepared his outfit to the moment he stood before Ai's house, he had not stopped smiling, clearly overjoyed, standing in front of the house filled with flowers. He knocked for a long time, but there was no response. Sensing something was wrong, he pushed the door open and was greeted by a scene of destruction. Furniture shattered everywhere. The servants he had hired to protect his mistress lay dead in the middle of the room. He rushed into the bedroom to find Ai's lifeless body sprawled on the floor. She was naked, her skin already covered with flies and maggots. Her once fair, smooth skin was now riddled with sores. Seeing this, Mr. Huong let out a scream, falling to his knees beside Ai's corpse, tears streaming down his face. He then turned and staggered back outside, ordering the driver, "Burn it all. Burn everything to the ground." The driver, a trusted servant, helped him into the car and quickly left to buy gasoline. The house was soon engulfed in flames. Sitting in the car, Mr. Huong clutched a hair clip he had bought as a gift for her birthday. His vision blurred with tears as he watched the house burn, the flames consuming every memory of their time together. The three spirits on the tree witnessed everything, the pain etched on Mr. Huong's face, his delicate handling of the new hair clip, his struggle to contain his sobs, and his helplessness. Ai wept along, tugging on Utha's sleeve. "Aunt Ha, seeing him like this, can we stop? Just this once." "No," Utha replied firmly. "Don't let him deceive you. He's only grieving for the child in your womb. If he truly loved you, would he have committed such despicable acts against me?" Intimidated by Utha's words, Tuesday Ai fell silent, her gaze following the car as it drove away. Utha was right. If he had truly loved her and their child, he would not have harmed an innocent girl's life. Worse still, after causing Ha's death, both he and his son had shown no remorse, as if the tragedy meant nothing to them. The car carrying Mr. Huong returned to the house and stopped before the heavy wooden doors for a long time before he slowly stepped inside. Hiding the hair clip in his pocket, Mrs. Huong was sipping tea, chatting leisurely with Mr. Hai in the central room. When she saw her husband, she greeted him indifferently. "You're back? Have you eaten?" "No need." Mr. Huong's voice echoed down the hall of the grand house, his single word cutting through Mrs. Huong's usual arrogance. She glanced around nervously, avoiding the sharp gaze of her husband, which seemed as if it could pierce her. "Did you know she was pregnant? Did you know it was not one life but two?" Mr. Huong enunciated each word, his face flushed, his eyes bloodshot with anger. "If I don't kill a wretched woman like you today, I swear I won't live to face the world again." He grabbed a nearby stick and charged at Mrs. Huong. She panicked, quickly hiding behind Mr. Hai, caught off guard. Mr. Hai had no time to react before the stick struck him on the head, splitting his face in half with blood running down. His eyes went wide, his mouth rigid. turning him into stone before he slumped to the ground with a dull thud. Everyone stood frozen at the horrific sight. Mrs. Huong collapsed beside Mr. Hai's body, weeping as if he were a close relative. Seeing this, Mr. Huong's suspicions were confirmed. His long-standing fears of harboring a snake in his bosom were true. These two were definitely having an affair behind his back. A venomous woman and an adulteress. You'll only find peace in the grave. Before she could react, he swung the stick at her again. She scrambled across the floor to dodge, but he managed to strike her in the leg, making her cry out in pain. She ran toward the door, screaming for the servants to open it. Seeing her flee, Mr. Huong chased after her with the stick in hand. The three spirits who had haunted the village for so long watched the entire scene from the rooftop. The spirit of Mr. Hai, just separated from his body, was also quickly chained by Ha to join Tin in bondage. If you need further help or additional translations, feel free to ask. Oh my! The wife kills the husband's mistress. The husband kills the wife's lover, so it's even. Ha ha ha! This family is really entertaining. Ha shot a glance at Tin, and then dragged him along as the spirit of Mr. Hai and AI followed to continue watching the drama unfold. The screams of Mr. and Mrs. Huong shattered the peaceful night, prompting villagers to light their lamps and peer out to see what was happening. Running until they reached the riverbank near Mr. Qian's house, Mrs. Huong stumbled over a rock and fell, hitting her carefully tended face on the gravel road, leaving one side scratched and swollen. She turned around just in time to see Mr. Huong catch up, his face red, panting heavily, and glaring down at her with fierce hatred. Die, you wicked woman, he shouted, raising the stick. Everyone watching was stunned with horror. Mrs. Huong, lying on the ground, reflexively raised her arms to shield herself, closing her eyes, too scared to look at her enraged husband. Suddenly, the stick in Mr. Huong's hand was flung into the river, causing everyone to gasp again. Mrs. Huong opened her eyes, surprised to see who had saved her, only to find four spirits standing behind her. Three of the spirits were familiar, while the fourth was unknown to her, though the slight bulge of its belly made it obvious who it was. Who gave you the right to decide life and death? Old man. Ha's voice was both sharp and mocking. The other three spirits sighed helplessly as they watched. Mr. Huong stood, shocked, staring at the pale figures before him. Some were his own blood. Others were his mistakes. Some were those he had loved. And one was his enemy. Either way, by the end of tonight, the Grim Reapers will drag me down to pay for my sins. So why not bring you two along with me for company? She challenged. Oh, girl. Why throw away your soul so recklessly to face such heavy punishment in the afterlife? A deep voice rang out, stopping Ha from attacking Mr. Huong. From behind Mr. Huong appeared a monk in saffron robes, prayer beads in hand, with a gentle, knowing smile as he regarded the four spirits. Ha, realizing this was a true monk, reverted from her demonic appearance to her former gentle self. Reverend, where have you come from? This is a matter between us and their family. I ask you not to interfere. I will not interfere. But before you take the lives of this couple, would you tell me why a once kind-hearted girl has turned into a vengeful spirit with such hatred? The monk asked. His question showed he understood the tragedy that had shaped her. Ha looked around at the villagers, including her parents and loved ones, who had all gathered. Her gaze softened, and she nodded in agreement with the monk. That night was Mr. Hin's birthday. I had saved a little money, and seeing my father's worn-out clothes, I said I was going to town to buy something but really wanted to get some fabric for him to make new clothes. After buying it, I noticed a busy bun shop filling the street with a delicious aroma. Knowing that my parents had never tasted anything like it, I joined the queue and waited hours to buy a few buns. By the time I reached the village entrance, night had fallen. As I walked past the largest house in the village, I saw Mr. Huong and his son standing outside, seeing off some guests, likely from a banquet. Both were drunk, and as soon as the guests left, they noticed me walking alone on the empty street. In his drunkenness, Kien stumbled over to block my way and teased me. As usual, I bowed my head, trying to escape, but then felt a large hand grab my waist. I looked up to see Mr. Huong's flushed face, reeking of alcohol, right next to me. In my panic, I struggled and managed to break free, running a few steps before someone grabbed me from the front. Mr. Huong lunged at me from behind, and together, he and his son dragged me under a large tree across from their brightly lit house. The son held my arms and legs while his father assaulted me, and then Mr. Huong held me while his son tormented me. The two men, completely lost in drunken lust, brutalized and beat me until I was covered in bruises. When they finished and saw my lifeless body sprawled on the hard gravel, clothes torn, bruises beginning to appear, Mr. Huong gave his son a nod, signaling him to handle the body. Kien ordered someone to bring a rope, tied it around my waist with a heavy rock on the other end, took me out on a boat, and dumped my body in the river. But heaven took pity, and the river spirit allowed my body to rise. My soul escaped and became a spirit, consumed by hatred, seeking revenge on those who wronged me. There's no need to recount what happened next. Kien, now able to speak, was forced by Utha to tell everything he had witnessed after his death. The more Mr. Huong heard, the more furious he became, and in a rage, he lunged at Mrs. Huong, hands around her neck. Hearing her misdeeds exposed, Mrs. Huong stood frozen, all of her usual arrogance and cruelty gone. Just as Mr. Huong's hands closed around her neck, Mr. Kien rushed forward to push him off. Mr. Huong, unable to overpower the young man, was left panting, sitting in helpless fury. With his confession finished, Kien continued, describing his mother's affair with Mr. Hai and then recounting Ai's tragic death. Each word brought gasps and murmurs from the crowd, with villagers pointing fingers at Mrs. Huong, who clasped her head in her hands, hair disheveled, speaking incoherently. "Everyone, calm down." The monk spoke. "I know the actions of this woman are deeply angering, and the grievances of the deceased are immense, but every fate is destined. Let's hear more of Utha's story." The villagers thought this was the end of Mr. Huong's wealthy family's tale, but Utha laughed. "Oh no, it's far from over. Over the past 7 days, I've uncovered another fascinating story related to Mr. Huong and his late friend, Mr. Huong." At the mention of that name, Mr. Huong's eyes widened, and he glanced nervously at Utha's spirit. Whispers filled the crowd. "Mr. Huong? Isn't he the one who went with Mr. Huong to find gold and fell to his death?" Utha began her story. "The day I became a spirit, I stayed near the phoenix tree by Kien's room, but I sensed another trapped spirit in this house, though it couldn't move freely. Following my intuition, I went to the room reserved for Mr. Hai when he performed rituals for Mr. Huong's family. At that time, Mr. Hai was busy in another room with Mrs. Huong, so I was free to explore his quarters. A room like his couldn't contain me. Searching thoroughly, I found a spirit trapped inside a jar under the bed and released it. That's when I learned about the despicable deeds of Mr. Huong. That spirit was Lam Tan Hung, a former resident of our village and a close friend of Mr. Huong. Both were orphans who grew up relying on the kindness of the villagers. Their lives were tough, spent fishing and selling their catch at the town market to survive. They were inseparable friends. When they turned 20, Mr. Huong got married to a girl in the village, an orphan herself who made a living growing vegetables and raising chickens to sell. She was a kind and diligent wife, always preparing food for both men whenever they returned from fishing. Even late at night, Mr. Hung, aware of his poverty, chose to remain single. He earned barely enough to feed himself and knew hunger all too well on days he couldn't sell his fish. Then one day, Mr. Huong proposed they go into the mountains to search for a rumored hidden stash of gold he had heard about from traveling merchants. Mr. Hung agreed without hesitation, unaware of how greed could eclipse any human bond. That night, They truly did find gold. After filling the sack with gold, Mr. Thuong suggested he carry the gold while Mr. Huong took their gear, so they could head back the same way. But on their way back, as they passed a cliff, Mr. Thuong intentionally slowed down and then heartlessly pushed his close friend off the edge, killing him instantly. Calmly, he carried the bag of gold back, playing the part of a grieving friend in front of the villagers of Kien to make them believe that Mr. Huong's death was just an accident. In the days that followed, Mr. Thuong was haunted by Mr. Huong's spirit, appearing to claim revenge, remembering a previous encounter with a sorcerer named Mr. Hai in the province. He hired him without hesitation, sparing no expense to trap Mr. Huong's spirit in a jar and imprison it under the bed. He even planned to use Mr. Huong's spirit as a slave to carry out his evil deeds once he succeeded. With Mr. Thuong's past crimes exposed, the villagers erupted in curses. Mr. Kien, who had been restraining him, released him in disgust. Mr. Thuong, now in a state of panic, stumbled toward the river, intending to drown himself, but young men from the village leapt in, pulling him back and tying a cloth around his mouth to prevent him from biting his tongue. "Young lady," the monk said to Utha, "you have both merit and sin, for taking vengeance on the dead and meddling in the affairs of the living. But on the other hand, you saved a tortured soul imprisoned for years. You sought revenge only on those who wronged you but also uncovered hidden grievances. The villagers now know the truth of your suffering, and justice has been served. But it's time for you and these spirits to follow the laws of heaven and earth." He continued, "These two people are already either mad or lost. Their lives won't last long. The good will be rewarded, and the wicked will be punished. The law of karma spares no one." Utha narrowed her eyes, looking at Mr. Thuong, whose whole body was drenched as he bowed repeatedly until his head bled. She then glanced at Mrs. Thuong, whose vacant eyes and silly grin showed that she was completely lost in madness, stuffing handfuls of dirt into her mouth. Utha understood that karma had already come for them. "Utha," the monk said, "it's no coincidence that I've appeared here at this time. Heaven has seen your suffering. If you, this girl, and this young boy come with me to the temple, you can find peace, listen to the scriptures, and free yourselves of resentment. This will lessen your punishment when the reapers come to take you." "And what about me?" Mr. Hai asked nervously, noticing the monk had not mentioned him. The monk's tone turned stern. "You claim to be a priest, yet you do not follow the righteous path. Instead, you use dark magic to do harm, committing terrible sins, deceiving people, and making them waste their wealth on you. Soon, the reapers will come to take you where you belong." Mr. Hai, silenced, knelt on the ground, helpless. The three spirits agreed to follow the monk to the temple, where they would listen to the scriptures each day to cleanse their karma. The monk collected the three spirits into clay jars. Before fading away, Utha looked back one last time at her family, her loved ones, and the people of Kien village, smiling gently and kindly, as she had when she was alive. In that moment, she returned to being the warm and pure Utha she once was. Witnessing his beloved about to leave forever, Ben felt a deep pain, tears streaming down his face, nearly collapsing. Thankfully, Mr. Kien held him steady. After that night, Utha's grievances were resolved, and the atrocities of Mr. Thuong's family were revealed. Enraged by their inhuman deeds, the villagers went to the grand house and tore it down. In Mr. Hai's room, they found the jar containing Mr. Huong's spirit, as Utha had described. Later, they built a shrine on the land where his house once stood, ensuring offerings of incense every day. Mr. and Mrs. Thuong, now completely insane, roamed in rags. On a cold winter's day, they found Mrs. Thuong hanging from a tree outside the village cemetery, while Mr. Thuong drowned in a river, his body swept away, with only a scrap of his clothing caught on a large stone where it was later discovered by fishermen. And so ended the lives of a greedy, cruel, and heartless family. Years later, She gave birth to a healthy, beautiful daughter. Their business flourished, and they built a grander home to care for Mr. and Mrs. Hin as if they were their own parents. After his father passed, Bin gave the house keys to Chi and her husband to look after. He wandered far and wide, doing odd jobs to survive, partly to forget the painful memories. Every year on Utha's death anniversary, he would return to prepare offerings and invite the villagers to join in. He would stay a few days and then leave again, never mentioning marriage. Perhaps, if it could not be Utha, he would never marry anyone else. Over time, Huong Kien village prospered, and the tale of the haunting was gradually forgotten. You have just listened to the short story, The Haunting of Huong Kien Village. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like translated or further assistance.